Breaking news. The state of Indiana has been sued over its latest voter suppression law targeting students. Welcome back to Democracy Docket. I'm Marc Elias.
And I'm Paige Moskowitz. Let's get started.
You know, Paige, it feels like if it is spring, it is time for the Republican legislatures of America to target student voting. I mean, if there is one consistent theme in Republicans around the country, is they hate the idea that students are able to vote. And so they find ever increasingly creative ways to target them. We've talked in past videos about what North Carolina has done. We've talked in past videos about what Florida has done. We've talked in past videos about what New Hampshire is doing. They're being currently sued. Of course, Texas is always good for a good voter suppression law targeting students. But today, Paige, we have breaking news out of the state of Indiana.
Earlier this year, Indiana enacted a law banning the use of student ID cards as a valid form of voter ID when casting your ballot. Before this law, for many years, Indiana let students vote using their ID card as their form of identification at the polls. Now, Marc, there were restrictions on that card. It had to be from a public university. It had to have a photo of the student and an expiration date. But in the year 2025, Republican lawmakers said no more. We should make it harder for students to vote.
Yeah, and Paige, I want to unpack this with you because, in fact, you know, what we have seen is that states seem to sort of multi-step this. You know, first they do a voter ID law and they include IDs only from their public universities, right? So step one is voter ID, but it matters whether you're at a public university or a private college. So like they kind of sweep out of the equation very quietly all of the private universities, even if those private universities are, you know, large institutions that have deep ties to the state and are able to produce, you know, identifications with the same level of security. Step two then becomes okay, we have state IDs, but the state issued IDs need to have certain requirements. And it's not so much the photo, because the photo are usually on student IDs, but it is this expiration date, right? So like a lot of the public university ID laws that we have seen in that sort of second wave is to say, oops, none of the public university IDs matter anymore. None of them fulfill the requirement because now they need to have an expiration date. And then the public universities have to either go through the trouble of reissuing those IDs or not. And the legislatures hope that they will like catch them there. But then you get the final step, which is where Indiana is, where it says, oops, never mind, actually no public university IDs, even though they are state issued, right? So like the initial premise of what at step one was, well, we need state issued IDs. These are state issued IDs. They are issued by public bodies of the state, but they sort of get taken out of the equation.
Right. And lawmakers' reasoning behind banning student ID cards altogether for voting was that they claimed it was a source of fraud. It would allow non-citizens to vote. But Marc, that just doesn't make any sense because the student ID cards are only used when you show up to go cast your ballot in person. They're not used for voter registration. There's a whole separate process to verify eligibility of voters when they register to vote. These students have already gone through that process. They're on the voter rolls in their county. They show up to vote. You're producing that ID to match a face with a name. The state has already said that they're an eligible voter.
Right. And look, there is no question that there are issues involving fake identifications around college campuses. I would dare say they are rarely the primary purpose is voting. And so, you know, the idea that a student is going to somehow fake an identification in order to vote in an election. I mean, I wish that there was such an outpouring of youth participation in our elections. It would be great. But the fact is, these populations tend to face a lot of barriers to voting. They are new to voting. They oftentimes have low turnout rates. So this concern that they have is completely pretextual. Plus, you know, the fact is, as you point out, the non-citizens who don't want to vote because they don't want to get arrested, right? It's a crime to vote. They also would have to have falsely registered to vote, and the state would have had to sort of mess up that at that level before you even get to the question, as you say, of turning up at the polls. But you know, I want to take a step back here and talk about why it is that so many states, including now Indiana, seem to want to disenfranchise students?
And the answer is that it's all about political power. Historically, college students have tended to vote Democrat, they vote more blue. And especially in areas where the university is a huge population center, it's powering the local economy, it has a lot of influence in politics in that region. Lawmakers may not want those students to vote because they want to secure power for themselves and they don't want to give even more power and influence to the college campus.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I hope everyone hears that because, there's no question there is a partisan purpose that Republicans have here as they do elsewhere, which is that, even with some shift in demographics, overall net, young voters tend to vote more Democratic, and particularly college young voters tend to vote more Democratic. But I think Paige has really captured the thing. And I go back to my own time as a college student, which was a very long time ago. I went to a small college in upstate New York, Hamilton College. And at that time, the local town simply didn't want Hamilton College students voting in the town because of what you said. It was political power. It wasn't whether we were Democrat or Republican. In fact, at that point, it was not as clear as it is now that there was as much partisanship among young voters. But they just didn't want, their local elections, including their congressional elections, influenced by people who they viewed as sort of illegitimate, right? Like people who shouldn't be voting in the election. There's a very old case out of Texas that goes all the way back, to the 1960s when, like, Texas towns didn't want members of the military who were stationed in Texas, who were drafted and stationed in Texas. They didn't want them voting. And again, it wasn't really about the national elections. It wasn't about the partisan effect. It was that the sense what Texas had was that these folks are not from here. They're not of us. They're not part of our communities, and we don't want them to vote. But here's the thing, and Paige, you have been a very prominent and eloquent spokesperson on this. That's not constitutional. Like, these students have a right to vote. If they establish residency and domicile in their college community, they have a right to vote there like anyone else.
Right, Mark. It was another lawsuit out of Texas that established that. That lawsuit happened in the 70s with Prairie View A&M University, where the local officials there did not want to allow college students to register to vote in the county using their campus addresses. Now the U.S. Supreme Court got involved, said that college students can vote using their student addresses. And Mark, I do want to point out that for as much as these local communities or counties may say they don't want to include college students in their local politics, they are more than happy to count those college students as residents when it comes time to the census and when it comes time to apportion congressional representation and federal funding.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So basically, what you're saying is in some of these more rural communities, and this is not just Indiana, this is generally, when they are fighting for an additional congressional seat, or for that matter, how they apportion state legislative chambers, like whether they get an extra, an extra seat in the state House or state Senate, those communities are quite happy to have these college students count.
The college students are counted as residents at their campus address for those purposes, which just boosts the local population numbers. And the whole concept of one person, one vote is that you're fairly allocating congressional power, legislative power to make congressional or legislative districts roughly the same size throughout the state. But if you're saying we're going to use your bodies to boost our population count for political representation, but we don't want you to cast your ballot here, I just don't understand how you can reconcile those two thoughts the way that these lawmakers are.
Yeah. And now a couple of things about the lawsuit itself. The first is it brings claims under various provisions of the Constitution. In full disclosure, my law firm is representing the plaintiffs in this case. It alleges First Amendment, 14th Amendment, and 26th Amendment claims, which is basically in plain English that there are impediments on the right to vote itself. In other words, this is burdening the students' ability to vote for no good reason. It is also potentially treating different groups of people who have state-issued IDs differently. And also, the 26th Amendment, for people who don't know, is specific to prevent discrimination against young voters. And the argument is that there is young voter discrimination. But I want to sort of put this in a larger context right now, which is that there is a lot of discussion about the need to expand the map and how, we have seen over time states like Indiana become sort of uncontested for many elections. It wasn't that long ago there were Democratic senators from Indiana. There were two and then one. And not that long ago, there was a Democratic governor of Indiana. So, these states, and I use Indiana as just an example here. We've talked in the past about Florida, and Ohio, which used to be big presidential swing states until very recently. Sherrod Brown was a senator from Ohio. Montana had two Democratic senators and a history of Democratic governors. So we've talked a lot in our videos, and Democracy Docket has written, and I've written on Democracy Docket about the need to not just expand the map electorally, but also to look out for the voting rights. Because if you have a two-tiered system of voting rights where, everyone in Pennsylvania basically has a lawsuit customized to their circumstances, but in Indiana, if you're a student, you're just kind of like ignored, that sends a broader message, both to the bad guys, but also to the voters, that somehow, there's less protections there.
Marc, before we go, I have one last question for you, because I think people will find this 26th Amendment aspect interesting. Supporters of this bill, or people who don't really care, may say, what's the big deal? You take away student ID cards. Those students should just go get a driver's license or another state ID. Or why would it target young people? You can go to school at any age. A person of any age could have a student ID card. Why does it specifically target young people or violate the 26th Amendment to ban student ID cards like this?
Yeah, so what's interesting about the 26th Amendment, which is shorthanded as the 18-year-old right to vote amendment, because that was the policy being effectuated when it was proposed and when it was enacted. It was the Vietnam War, and there was a sense that people who were being drafted at 18 should be able to vote. They shouldn't have to wait until they were 21 when they were drafted earlier. But when the 26th Amendment was actually constructed, when it was actually drafted, it didn't say 18-year-olds have the right to vote. What it said is that you cannot discriminate against people based on age for anyone over 18. So essentially what it does is it parallels the provisions of the Constitution that, for example, guarantee Black voters equal protection and equal voting rights. It parallels the language of the 19th Amendment, which protects women's right to vote. And so just like you couldn't pass a law that said, people who change their last name upon marriage are not able to vote, because that would target women without saying women, right? You can't do that with respect to young voters either. And though there are some men who change their name upon getting married, and there are some women who don't change their name upon getting married, everyone would understand that to be targeting women. And likewise here, yes, there are students who are older and there are students who are younger, and everything you just said, but it is pretty widely understood that targeting student IDs at colleges and universities is targeting a younger demographic. It is targeting people at the beginning of their voting process, and therefore should be subject to the 26th Amendment. Now, we will see what the federal courts say about that, but that is the argument that has been advanced in other cases. That is the argument that many law professors have written about. And I think if you go back and read the language of the debates about the 26th Amendment, that is pretty clearly what Congress had in mind. So thank you for everyone who has already signed up for Democracy Docket to become a subscriber. We will see you next time for the next edition of Democracy Docket.